I want to start the program by reading a message about a lifelong anti-imperialist who just got out of prison after 45 years. So, we've been asked and I'm talking, of course, about Herman Bell. And he is a much beloved, much respected, much cherished revolutionary. And the people who have organized a lot of the work around him, the support work around him, sent out a message. So I want to explain why I'm not screaming and yelling as I would want to celebrate him being released. So this is the message that they sent out. On Friday, April 27th, it's just 2 days ago, it's hard to believe, a 70-year-old respected elder was released after serving nearly 45 years in prison. Herman was one of thousands of incarcerated older people who was repeatedly denied parole for over a decade after completing his minimum sentence, which was 25 years. His release is a result of important and urgent changes in the criminal legal system and parole regulations that are part of nationwide efforts to end mass incarceration. Let us hope that Herman's release brings inspiration for more change. Herman is deeply humbled and grateful for the broad expressions of trust and support, but out of respect for the feelings of the victims' families, he will not be making any public statements. We welcome him home. Now, we got word in Philadelphia, you know, tomorrow's a big, very critical court hearing for Mumia in Philadelphia. And the widow, who is a stooge of the police, has been for decades, Maureen Faulkner, the widow of the cop who was originally killed and for which Mumia was charged, has put out a statement saying this cop killer, referring to Herman Bell, is now home, and we don't want to see that happen to Mumia. So we are going to be in court very, very early tomorrow. In a few minutes, Gil Obler will be here and he'll be saying bus tickets and car tickets for those who still have not bought tickets. But this case, this issue of mass incarceration is a life and death issue for thousands and thousands of people, among whom Herman Bell and Mumia Abu-Jamal. So this event was originally planned as a small event to give Mireille Fanon a chance to give a report on her international work, and this conference is happening in France, in Paris, called the Bandung of the North. And I don't know how this developed into this amazing cast of characters that we have speaking today. One after another, it seemed impossible not to include them at this moment. And of course, this moment also is a moment when Mumia's book on imperialism has just come out. So I was telling Mumia about how this, I saw him on Thursday, I was telling him about how this event developed. He said it's the moment, the historical moment, imperialism, and how many voices are coming together to talk about that. So we'll be having them speak very briefly, but before anybody leaves this room, I want first of all to thank Johnny Stevens. Johnny, will you raise your hand in the back? Without whom this could not have been done. everything he does. International Action Center for all the support they've given us, non-stop, including this space, while they're trying to work on the May Day event on Tuesday. When we came in, everything was all set up for May Day. They cleared it up for us, and as always, made space available on very, very short notice, and more than graciously, really as constant comrades. I also want to thank the two people who are serving the food in the back. Could you both raise your hands? Alma and Devlin. And I have to, and also part of Workers' World and International Action Center, and I have to say this, though she'll kill me. Leland Schoenstein did the flyer, and she is an incredible political artist. Could you raise your hand? And she is mad at me, I can tell. But so many people commented on this flyer, and she's done this over and over again. Where's Leland? Right here in the front row. Estella was one of the people, and Leland is, of course, a longtime activist, and the funny thing is someone said to me, who did this flyer? We've got to use her. Yes. So our speakers, we have a very powerful group of speakers and are adding to it because we have 3 guests from Venezuela, and at this moment we couldn't not have them in the program, so they're going to be part of the program as well. But our first speaker is Mireille Fanon, who, where is Mireille? She's probably in the back. Oh, there she is. Mireille, of course, is the president of the Fanon Foundation in Paris, and that foundation has sponsored so many events and done so many things in this last period. Way before that, she had already done lots of international work, and of course been a supporter of Mumia for a long time. She also was part of, she was for I guess a couple of years, 3 years, was an expert. This is in human rights, United Nations language. So her title was expert, and she had been at that time the chair of the United Nations Working Group on People of African Descent. And she will talk a lot about people of African descent and what the various movements in the world are doing about that, as well as educate us about this upcoming conference of in Bandung. And for those who don't know, Bandung is a name that, and she will talk about that as well, but the original Bandung conference was in 1955 in Indonesia, and it was a major anti-colonial conference that started many, many processes in the anti-colonial movement. And this coming one that's coming in May is the one for 2018, is called Bandung of the North. So Mireille will say more about that. Please welcome my friend, comrade, and activist, and scholar. What else do we call you? Come on up, Renee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. How are you? Good. I'm very happy to go back in this room. I was there, I think, 1 month ago or 2 months ago, or maybe later. Just regarding what Suzanne said about my UN expertise. I just ended my mandate last September, not 3 years ago.
You had it for 3 years, no?
I have 6 years. I did that during 6 years. And we had a country visit in US, if you remember, and if you read the report, you can watch it on the website of the African UN Working Group of African Descent. You can get it on this. And there was a little noise around the report because I imposed to the working group to speak on reparation, if you remember. Okay, I wrote, as usual, I wrote my paper because I'm not fluent in English. And also to don't think in French when I am thinking in English. It creates a lot of embarrassment and confusion. That's why I prefer to read it. And I am there to be tomorrow in Philadelphia for the hearing. And it is my first reason why I am here. And to support Mumia since a long time now. I don't remember exactly when, but long time. And we hope to get the reopening of his file. And I have to present of Bandung of South, Bandung of North, and reparation. And you will see there is some link between South, North, and reparation. And you can see the where is the here? Here it is the flyer for the Bandung of North in Paris from 3 to 6 May next week. And one of the speakers are already Angela Davis. Mumia Abu Jamal is the godfather of the Bandung, and he will send a message, but also Léonard Pelletier, and also George Ibrahim Abdallah. I don't know if you know him. George Ibrahim Abdallah is one of the oldest prisoner in French country, political, from Lebanon. And he was accused of a crime he did not commit, of course. And even the French secret said he was not there when the crime was committed. But even with that, he is not released. Even if every year some judge asks for his release, until now he's not released, and now it is 30 years in French jail. It's not specifically US tradition. And also there will be a message from Danny Glover and from other people. Okay. Bandung is no longer a proper name, or more precisely, for more than half a century, Bandung has become the name of our common. In 1955, the Bandung Conference brought together representatives from 29 African and Asian countries, politically grounding the idea of the Third World, now known as the Global South, turning its back on the capitalist West and as a real socialism. This Afro-Asian alliance is built on much more than just geography. If South Africa apartheid, colonialist Israel, or counter-revolutionary Taiwan were excluded, it was because this summit announced an uncompromising political project, that of transcending the geopolitical dishes of which the great imperial powers had until then used to hide their brutality. Its ambition was to unite all the opponents of colonialism and imperialism in search of a new political, intellectual, and cultural autonomy. As Frantz Fanon wrote, I quote, "Bandung is the historical commitment of oppressed people to help one another and to impose a definitive retreat on the exploitation forces," end quote. In the North, this call inspired Black Americans, in particular, were moved by the futures they were offered. The hurt, I quote, "the hurt, the insult, the wounded, the dispossessed." In short, it was the oppressed of the human race who were gathering. The consensuousness of class, race, and religion manifests itself on a world scale, unquote. And this quote is from Richard Wright, who attended the debate. Malcolm X considered there as a model the capacity of the former colonized to meet, despite their difference around a primordial struggle against white supremacy, was to inspire the Black diaspora. It still animated us. But time passed. In the spring of Bandung, still acquainted with the strategy of non-violence that offered its independence to India, succeeded the summer of armed conflict. But the counter-revolution was no long in coming, and here we are again at the heart of autumn, no, of the colonial winter. Neocolonialism, the ultimate stage of imperialism, has been slashed, taking the reasonable pace of international institutions, IMF, World Bank, under the name of structural adjustment. They orchestrated a neoliberal blackmail that has strived to put the southern state on their knee, for the greater benefit of Western capitalist and comprador elites. At the same time, the apostles of the imperialist war did not hesitate to exhume the old notion of just war to better base the rapacity of their empires of the North on the mirage of humanitarianism. Those who are exiled to the West, seeking to flee their unbearable devastation, are hindered by walls, checkpoints, fascist militia, and border guards. State racism has been constantly reinventing itself in haste and fear, in the face of the inevitable intellectual, economic, and political decade of white and Christian Europe and America. The cynical cyclic repressive violence that hits strikers, protesters, and rioters is the ultimate proof of political impotence, bandaging the muscle of its corpse, unable to stem a rebellion that has become chronic. It is irremediable. The countries of Europe are no longer themselves. The empires have dreamed of being confused with the world while remaining white, and realized their dream with weapons in the hand. They were planting their roots in Africa, America, Asia, but believed they could preserve their national racial homogeneity, already doubtful. It was a misconception that the child born of the rape of an enslaved does not share the trait of the master. In northern countries, racial diversity is now the norm. The politicization of this new condition is an invaluable challenge. This implied thinking about the meeting of heterogeneous population, but linked by common interest, indigenous people who through the America continue to struggle for their sovereignty. The old diaspora descendant of enslaved transships from the African coast. The new post-colonial diaspora, linked in particular to capitalism exploitation or political and social exclusion. Of this new damned of the earth, projected by the history in the heart of the white empires, Bandung of the North wants to facilitate the dialogue. If these voices are indispensable, it is because the political statu quo in which we are currently incarcerated is unbearable. Fascism offers no escape from neoliberal winter, but rather an intensification of its most deadly slopes. The foolish project of capitalism in one country, which would benefit only one race, will generate new apartheid and ethnic cleansing in quantity. However, will we have the luxury of being happy with the political offer of the current left? In France, Spain, Italy, and Belgium, the populist strategy was able to gather its voters only at the price of a return intoxicated with national flag, still soiled with the blood of our ancestors, and with chauvinistic harangues that these ancient colonial metropolises have hosted with ecstasy. A whole section of this slave, denying state racism, only envisaged its unity at the cost of the exclusion of racial minority and especially of the social interests they carry. The xenophobic treatment of religious and migratory questions is the exorbitant proof. Because they are the most familiar with the violence and lies that the so-called democratic states are capable of, it is up to the non-white diaspora to pioneer new political ways. To achieve this, it is necessary to found a decolonial international. Its three main axes will be the fight against state racism that condemns us to social death, the struggle against imperialism that made capitalism, extractivism, and wars of conquest the law of the world. And lastly, the dissolution of the ideology of modernity, which condemns us to live in the perverse and unachievable dreams of white supremacy. In 1955, the Bandung Conference gave body and voice to the people who made up most of the world. Pursuing this unfinished work of humanization, the Bandung of the North announced the dawn of a new sun. Let it burn the ancient world and see us reappear untouched in the midst of ruined empires. I would say that one of the first engagements to be done is to force the former colonial empire to pay its debt, and one of the most enormous is the voluntarily forgotten crimes committed against humanity introduced by the discovery that led to the greatest demographic and metaphysic catastrophe. The only way to settle the crimes of genocide and the crimes against humanity is to force the colonizing state to repair them, because they have built their wealth on the life and blood of our ancestors, and they legally organize their impunity. It is a question of reparation and restoration of the sense of humanity, to stop the ideology of domination, asking the victim to pay not only the price of his alienation, but also that of his new servitude, as well as 80, which is 1825, had to pay for 200 years a debt in payment of his independence, and some newly liberated states of the colonial yoke that have not yet stopped paying a colonial tax that subjects them to obligation. And most of this African country, are francophone, as you may imagine. Let us not be deceived. The abolition of enslavement, presented as the indispensable measure to restore the enslaved in their citizenship, was only for the purpose of perpetuating a system of domination operating in the same hierarchical sense, from new former slave owners to new liberated enslaved. Are not they, from this time, precarious new employees, de facto condemned to continue working on the plantation of their former master, which for decades has frozen the economy of exploitation? It can be said that the abolition adopted by special law combine at the same time the compensation of the master, which confirms them in the certainty that they had done well, the refusal of the compensation of the enslaved people, and that of an agrarian reform, which keeps them in a subhuman statute. What was done at the time should be done today, but still cannot be realized since former enslaver state denied the reality of the palpable consequences of enslavement. In a word, the state continued to pursue with method its colonial policy in order to maintain a regime of exploitation, even if it seems to make some concession. It is not wrong to affirm that the attitude of the former colonized state is, in this respect, astonishing and organized towards a culture of impunity, whereas crimes against humanity are imprescriptible even in international law. How to interpret this voluntary amnesia, and especially how to analyze it? We must return to the perception of the human being developed by the Western country, where, in contexts marked by racial violence and colonial dispossession, humanity has never been a common and shared condition, but a privilege. It can be said that the problem of constructing the ideology of politics of race in order to categorize humanity has been exemplary. The reparation obliged to redefine the framework from which the human rights must be shared and to move away from the references which drain with them crimes against humanity, genocide, theft, war. It is therefore interesting to read the first French Constitution as well as the Declaration of Independence of the United States. One affirms the freedom and equality of rights among all citizens, which had already been guaranteed by the Declaration of the Human Rights and Citizens from 1789. In the meantime, millions of people have fallen by the wayside, enslaved. They are excluded from all rights, and it is on this lie that was built, on the one hand, the French nation, and the other hand, its reputation as fatherland of the human rights. The other, in its Declaration of Independence, United States emphasizes that, I quote, we hold for obvious, maybe the translation is not good, but you know exactly what I am referring. The following truths: all made are created equal. They are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the search for happiness, end quote. For all, that the maintenance of enslavement of all those who were there has not ceased or reduced between this declaration and the final abolition. Well beyond the abolition, this ideology of domination continued. The United States then passed to the Jim Crow law, which installed a new old social order, and then to a justice which does not still punish the crimes committed, thereby organizing impunity for the police and reinforcing structural racism, a common element of all former colonial countries. The Western world owes its existence to its acceptance to consider millions of people inferior to its citizens. This was possible only because to take these two countries, the dominant ones showed a deliberate blindness of what constitutes in those whom they tore off from their continent their humanity, their sense of the other, their relationship to the land, and the laws and customs that allowed them to be in the world, and this despite the wars between tribes and even slavery as a war practice. The white people practiced enslavement in the name of the king or God and progress, but certainly not in the name of the human. The self-proclaimed superiority of Europe was built on the declared inferiority of millions of human beings, dehumanized by Code Noir or Black Codes in US, a way to arrogate power to territories and wealth, but also on the thought, the construction of knowledge, which would limit the national narrative of the greatest bankruptcy of the humanity, which in fact also gave their power over the being and especially over the non-being that were enslaved and who will then become worker, poor, women, exclude migrants, all who are fundamentally banned from visibility and voice. This ontological lie that continues to gangrene the perception of what the human should be comes from the power that white Europeans have imposed by the installation of a moral Manichaeism based on the apprehension of the human by race. It has been developed to such a level that it is from this belief that the social world has been organized, preventing by all possible means that the man, just out of his condition of enslavement, cannot neither to question the world, nor to become agent of transformation or for interrogation, and still less to accept the institutional inferiority in which the dominant ones maintain him. There is an obligation to decolonize the enclosing and never effective discourse on human rights, and especially that put in place since the abolition. The freedom of the new free has resulted in the maintenance of the established order, the obligation to work, and the unfailing recognition of the emancipatory republic or state, and especially this the obligation to forget the past. It is the erasure of this past which is reflected in the various declarations and other international normative instruments, with measures making it possible to restrict it in different fields and contexts. Not to mention that at the end of enslavement and colonialism, justice has been a justice apart, and especially on the margin of common law, which can still be seen in the Caribbean and America, where the land still belongs to those who acquire it through violence and theft. It is not a question of making this declaration more moral or more just, but of reflecting under the impetus of the damned a new definition of humanity based on the perception that the colonized, the damned, have of what should be the humanity. It is indeed the whole colonial matrix that must be deconstructed in order to bring out social relations that are free from the ethno-racial reference and to bring out a humanity sought out of the lines of force imposed by modernity, where man can relate to man wherever he is, because the decolonial condition will allow him to escape collectively from the zone of non-being. It is question of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. I'm very eager to, as many of us I'm sure are, to hear the results of Bandung conference that's happening next week. Mireille didn't mention all the names, but there's some very powerful people from around the world participating in that conference. I just want to say a word that some people might wonder, or maybe not, why a Mumia group, and by the way, I'm the international spokesperson for International Concerned Family and Friends of Mumia Abu Jamal, and the head of that organization is a small woman back there named Pam Africa. And not only did Pam come here from Philadelphia, and I told her not to because we all have to be in court so early tomorrow morning, but we have a whole bunch of people from Philadelphia. And our politics, internationalism is often misinterpreted or the word is used casually. Our politics has been always of reciprocity. We don't come to countries to just ask for solidarity for Mumia, for political prisoners. We go to Venezuela to give solidarity to the people and government of Venezuela. We go to Haiti to give solidarity to the people of Haiti. Wherever we go in the world, that is the message. So I just want to say something about that, the politics and the history of this movement on this issue. So our next speaker is, when you hear what Mireille was talking about, our next speaker who will be talking about Mumia's book. Mumia's book is, so I know most people didn't get a chance to read it, but you will, I'm sure. His book is so filled with concepts of humanity and inhumanity and the denial of humanity to large sectors of the population. I guess the next speaker knows that he's about to speak. On cue. So I'm very happy to welcome Glen Ford, a much respected and admired revolutionary intellectual. And he's going to review this quite remarkable book.
Mumia and Stephen have produced, I think, a kaleidoscope of a book. It's a sweeping, panoramic examination of the rise, but not yet fall, of the U.S. empire. Mr. Vittoria writes that he originally wanted to tell this story in a 90-minute film, but then he came to his senses and he spoke to Mumia, and they decided that they would do it in 300 pages. And that alone is remarkably ambitious, because if you're going to tell the story of the United States and its so-called civilization, then you have to tell the story of European colonialism and the European war against the world that then led to the creation of this supposedly indispensable and very exceptional and oh so unique country that claims the right to lord it over all the other peoples of the earth. When you're writing a book, when you're making any kind of presentation, and it is a critique of the powers that be, you run into the same problem, whether you're a radio reporter like Mumia used to be before they snatched him up into the gulag, or anyone else making a presentation against the rulers. The rulers lie all the time. Everything they say is propaganda. And everything they say is the opposite of truth. It's not just not true. It's the opposite of truth. They turn truth on its head. In fact, the best way to find out what's truth is to do the opposite or read the opposite of what they say. But this creates another burden on those who are trying to tell the truth, because before we can even present an examination, an analysis of what is really going on in reality, we have to wade through their lies. And everything they say is a lie. And so then it becomes incumbent on us to put together an alternative examination of history. And I think that this book measures up to that mission that is imposed on us. I think we're seeing here that the premise of this book is that the empire is now and always has been at war with the darker peoples of the earth. It's not just a saga about this king or that king. It is a war undertaken by the rulers of a certain part of the world against everybody. As Abu Jamal and Vittoria write, American history is founded in genocide, nurtured through slavery, and perpetuated by endless war. The rulers of the United States deny, that's one of their lies. They deny that they're presiding over an empire. But the English white settlers certainly saw their outpost on the East Coast as an empire in the making. They were quite conscious of what they were doing, and they didn't mind saying so, that they were going westward and south and north and any place else they could steal and plunder. That was their political project. Empire building. We see an amazing continuity in the behavior of this white supremacist empire at all of its stages of development. It's not a mysterious kind of motion. They do the same thing over and over again, only limited by their capabilities to plunder and rob and steal and, of course, lie. Yesteryear's manifest destiny is essentially the same as today's U.S. exceptionalism. It is the same doctrine. It provides justification for every crime that the empire commits against weaker peoples. As the authors put it, although the term manifest destiny was coined in 1845, the seeds, they say, of manifest destiny arrived with Christopher Columbus when he stumbled onto the shores of North America. It is a pan-Western European doctrine. When the U.S. Says that it's going to bomb Syria, no matter what the United Nations Security Council says, which they did just a couple of weeks ago. What the U.S. is saying is that it has an exceptional right to violate international law. Enough said, and then they bombed. Just as when the U.S. wanted a canal to connect under their auspices the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, they simply took the territory of Panama away from the sovereign nation of Colombia. And most Americans don't even know that that happened, that Panama was created for the convenience of the United States and the wealth of the people who rule it. When King George told the white settlers that they could not go across the Allegheny Mountains to steal more Indian land, more Native American land, they decided that they had the unique and exceptional right to reject their government's sovereignty over them and go across the Allegheny. But to do that, they had to declare independence from the British Crown. They thought that that was their God-given destiny, and the rest is our lying-ass history. And it was manifested after 1776. Although these same white settlers rejected their Englishness, they more deeply embraced, especially after independence, more deeply embraced their whiteness. And they would later create the world's most racially regimented society, a Jim Crow order that inspired Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler said so. Hitler, of course, was surely a Holocaust for the Jews, but the European breakout of 1492 was the mother of all human holocausts. It was a catastrophe, a disaster, a cataclysm, which is the way Palestinians describe what happened to them in 1948. It was a Nakba for all the peoples. 1/5 of the world population died in the half century after Christopher Columbus got off that boat in Hispaniola. That's 20% of humanity gone. Whole nations of Native Americans were wiped off the face of the earth. A death from disease and from forced labor and starvation was at 95% and sometimes 100%. Hitler did his death camps, but the white settlers created a hemisphere of death, 2 continents of death. Mumia and Vittoria's book notes that between 60 and 80 million Africans died or lost their freedom to this Nakba, the aftermath of Columbus and 1492. It was a disaster like the world has never seen and has not seen since, although the current rulers of the United States certainly have some horrors in store for us that may match it. The European slave trade took the lives, as we said, of 60 million Africans. Now, the Arabs and the Persians had traded Africans, but the European slave system transformed the world, replacing and displacing whole peoples. As Eric Williams wrote in 1944, this slave trade propelled Europe's rise to global economic dominance and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. A century before Eric Williams said that, a guy named Karl Marx wrote that it is slavery that has given the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition for large-scale industry. It therefore follows that slavery created the conditions for the very existence of the industrial working class. Edward Baptiste, he has a wonderful book, came out in 2014. It's titled The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. And it shows how the overseers speeded up the cotton picking process to such a degree, so fiercely, that they doubled and even tripled the production of cotton per acre without introducing even one technological innovation. And that made the owners fantastically rich. And so this was an industrial scale kind of work, with the slaves doing industrial scale work and being themselves bundled and sold and insured under a securities bundle kind of arrangement, which was very, very much like, almost identical legally to, the kind of housing bundles that we heard about, that we only learned about in terms of popular knowledge after the 2007 meltdown. In their book, Vittoria and Mumia wrote, for 200 years, American historians and propagandists, and they're often the same thing, American historians and propagandists have conveniently tried to frame slavery as somehow pre-capitalist, when in fact this horrific chapter in Europe and America's history is inherent in the wealth building of the modern era. And I would add that lots of folks who call themselves leftists and Marxists also tried to put slavery somehow to the side as if it did not involve a working class, even as black folks were working on a speeded up industrial schedule, making this cotton for the industrialists in Britain to become fantastically wealthy about. This book even takes a look at the great Zanj black slave rebellion in Iraq that occurred in 869. And the authors report that there are Iraqis today who consider themselves to be black, and that during the occupation, they were hoping, or some of them were hoping, that President Obama, the chief occupier, might do something for these black Iraqis. And some black folks back here thought that he ought to do that too, but none of this came to pass. Obama, no less than any other US president, showed the continuity of US imperial policy, and that it is rooted in manifest destiny. And I think his blackness actually points up the continuity, that it does not really matter. Obama's predecessor, George Bush, sabotaged the Durban World Conference on Racism that was in Durban, South Africa back in 2001. That conference was designed to address the issue of compensation for slavery and for colonialism. The conference mandate was to make Europe and its white settler colonies accountable for the crimes of the Great Nakba that began in 1492, and which, of course, continues today. The United States was conceived as a nation to perpetuate those crimes, crimes that it celebrates as it turns truth on its head, crimes it celebrates as the apex of civilization, with them being the apex. And so that Durban conference that was sabotaged in 2001 had to be similarly torpedoed in 2009, and that was the role of President Obama. Obama's sabotage of Durban, too, in the first year of his presidency, showed definitively that nothing post-racial even remotely occurred in the United States with his election. The first black president was defending the global racial and economic order that sprang from the catastrophe of 1492. Western Europe had made war on the world. It enslaved and it plundered the darker majority of the world. And they called that the spread of civilization. They called that the spread of a superior civilization, and they still claim, after all these crimes, half a millennium of crimes, they still claim that they're a superior civilization. In the process of that destruction, they destroyed or retarded the two biggest economies in the world, the economies of India and China. in addition to the rape of Africa and the annihilation of the peoples of the Americas. So if this is civilization, then it is a civilization that we must destroy, along with the capitalist system that was birthed in the blood of slaves. The United States is today determined to complete the global conquest that was launched by Europe in 1492. It seeks world hegemony of global capitalism, headquartered in the white supremacist United States. That mission is the same whether the president is Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Donald Trump. And that means that our mission, which is Mumia and Vittoria's mission, is to first end this 500-year Euro-American war against the rest of the planet. And two, it is to transform the social relations among our people so that the forces of war and exploitation do not rise again. We've got to stop the Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe. The perfection and the completion of this global conquest, this Nakba for humanity, is the goal of both the Republican Party and the Democratic parties, both of which answer to the economic architects of human enslavement and the subordination of humankind to capital and to white supremacy. That world order is actually codified in legal terms in the structures of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was devised under President Obama, and which President Trump, now having been advised by his Goldman Sachs and other advisors, President Trump is now talking about resurrecting this TPP that he had railed against previously. If the United States cannot achieve this kind of world economic order at the point of a gun through negotiations, then they will just do so by raw force. They have plunged the world into terror, and they put that terror in the guise of a war on terror. They claim to be fighting against terror when they are the creators of terror. It's a war in which they have brazenly financed and armed and diplomatically protected the various brands of Al-Qaeda, who are the very same jihadists that they claim to be fighting against. Their capacity for lies is infinite. Indeed, their corporate media's foreign coverage is now nothing but lies. And I'm sure you join me in saying that it's very difficult to actually watch the corporate media. Nothing comes out of the bourgeois mouth but lies. It's difficult to justify watching their nightly newscasts with the idea that, well, I can get a glimmer of truth, because often there is not even a glimmer of truth in their coverage. But it's actually been much like that in the past. The lies of the present are built on the lies of the past. The white man's burden under Great Britain becomes full spectrum dominance under the imperial United States. The centuries of terror that ensued after 1492 are repeated in the US-led terror in Libya and Syria and elsewhere. King Leopold's slaughter of 10 million Congolese is being matched by the genocide of 6 million Congolese under Presidents Clinton and President Bush and Obama and now Donald Trump. And that's why Mumia and Vittoria's book is so valuable. It is sweeping. It does have the effect that Vittoria envisioned when he was thinking about that movie. It is informed largely by the voices of those who witnessed and opposed the Nakba over the last 500 years as it enveloped and then transformed the world over the space of half a millennium. This book and other books reinforces our determination that this epoch of human history be brought to an end. We don't have a whole bunch of different struggles and movements. The larger movement is to bring to an end this period that we can date to 1492. It tells us, and I'm talking about the book, that arms production escalates in the United States, not just because it is fantastically profitable, although it is, but because it is necessary to maintain the capacity to wage war on most of the planet all of the time, which is U.S. strategic planning. They plan to wage simultaneous wars in different parts of the planet. And just as Britain destroyed the industries of India and of China and humiliated China in the process to achieve its supremacy, the United States tries desperately to contain and coerce the rising economies of the East. Although it can't figure out how to do it, it does try. The Monroe Doctrine still lives. It's not dead at all. It was extended to the Pacific with the seizure of Hawaii in the 1800s. And then in 1898, with the colonization of the Philippines. And then President Wilson enforced the Monroe Doctrine with his occupation of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And President Truman extended this Monroe Doctrine kind of thinking to the whole of what he called the free world. And he did that under a nuclear threat. And JFK cited the Monroe Doctrine when he attacked Cuba, and he used that to justify sending the Green Berets all over Latin America and laying the groundwork for most of the nations of South America descending into military dictatorships. And President Eisenhower and President Carter both extended the Monroe Doctrine to the Middle East. They said it was of strategic value to the United States, which is code word for I will go to war over this. And President Reagan enforced the Monroe Doctrine in Grenada in 1983. And President Bush enforced the Monroe Doctrine again in Panama in 1989. And now we have a U.S. Space Command to oversee the planet from on high. And we have an Africa Command to oversee the military occupation of that continent. And we have domestically a judiciary, a court system that is packed with so-called Federalist judges. Those are the lawyers who believe that the Constitution should be interpreted in the way that the founding fathers, these founding rich white fathers, intended that it be interpreted. And we know what their intentions were, that this be a white man's country where black people of any status have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Judge Taney told us that was so. In fact, it was one of the longest Supreme Court decisions that was ever reached up to that time in the Dred Scott decision. And if anybody thought that this still wasn't real, the real effective law of the land in the United States, despite the Civil War and the amendments, they have learned differently with the imposition of the upgraded form of mass black incarceration. That, in fact, was the national response to the Black freedom movement of the 60s. It is that new Jim Crow that put Mumia on death row and now life in prison, from where he gives us this book. The world's largest prison system, backed by the world's biggest police state, is the logical product of the Nakba that began in 1492. And it is our duty to bring that catastrophe to an end forever. Power to the people.